Thank you very much, Richard, and welcome everybody. Like I've said, it's a real honour to be able to give this presentation tonight as president, and I look forward to meeting you all in person very soon. So yes, where we work on many different aspects of silica-rich volcanic eruptions, and the image that you can see here is of the eruption of Cauye in Chile in 2012. And we made many observations of this rare rhyolitic eruption, which have made us kind of scratch our heads really, kind of wonder exactly what is going on in the conduits that are feeding rhyolitic eruptions. And the more we're finding out, the kind of less certain we are about things that we all, really held close to us a few years ago. So we're starting to doubt many of the established thinking linked to the mechanisms of eruptions. So this rather provocative title, Is All Lava Actually Ash?, is designed to kind of stimulate dissent essentially. And I'm hoping that you'll tell me this is absolute rubbish. It's not at all true. There is lava that is lava. But we are just starting to wonder and doubt somewhat, because we feel that we're finding evidence for, in many cases, lava having fragmented underground before it comes out to the surface. And we think this can be quite an interesting new twist on what happens in volcanic eruptions. So it's work that I've done with loads of different people, collaborators, students over the last kind of 20 years or so. So this is a summary of some of this work. And in particular, we'd like to mention Fabian Wordsworth in the University of Durham, who's a close co-worker and friend. So I'll just tell you a little bit about me because we haven't met yet. So I'm Cumbrian, brought up near Loweswater, a little place called Tefrite, if anyone knows Tefrite. And I really caught the geology bug when I was brought up in the Cumbrian fells, going up Low Fell and Melbreck, and then going down to haystacks and finding how different haystacks was from these other fells, and wanting to know why. And just really got into geology thanks to my parents, especially my dad, who is a real kind of rockhound. And thanks to that connection, I've really got to love geology and love Cumbrian geology too. And as you've mentioned, I'm now a volcanologist at Lancaster University. My PhD was with the Open University, and I've been in lots of other places too. And I've just got some of the teaching that I do here. So teach a fair amount of stuff about geological hazards and volcanology. And for the last 10 years or so, I've also directed a master's degree in volcanology in Lancaster, which was the first volcanology masters in the UK. And my research, as you said, I look at volcanic eruption dynamics, and also starting to branch out into geothermal energy, looking at soils and pollution and microplastics and things like this. So that's a little bit about myself, but I look forward to meeting you all in person more to hear more about you too. So when you think about the style of a volcanic eruption, it's kind of clear, isn't it? It's either explosive, and there's an example here from Soufriere St. Vincent in the Caribbean in April 2021, last year, taken by my PhD student Yvonne Howe, of an ash plume that's been created in a powerful explosion. Or it could be effusive, and this is this startling photo from Fagradalsfjord in Iceland last year, of many people safely observing the advance of lobes of basaltic lava. So this is the style of volcanic eruptions, okay? So explosive or effusive, where effusive means that you have the outpouring of lava, and explosive means that you're fragmenting the magma underground into pieces. And so this means that we therefore think that an eruption could have two different phases. For example, this is common, that you start off with an explosive phase, and then this changes to an effusive stage at the end of the eruption. So here are some images from Iceland, from a spectacular place called Landmannalaugar, if you know this, and the volcano Torfjökull. And this is a view on the left-hand side of volcanologist Jackie Owen, who's at Lancaster University, standing on top of a great big pile of ash from the explosive phase of an eruption. And then here we can see some rhyolitic lava, some blocky rhyolitic lava that was emplaced at the end of one of these eruptions. So we're pretty confident here. We've got explosive makes ash and diffusive makes lava, and these are different things. And the difference there is that when you create ash, the magma is fragmenting underground in explosions. It's being ripped apart by pressurized gases. These are volcanic gases. There's in particular water that's dissolved in magma at depth, and then it drastically expands as the magma reaches the surface due to the pressure change, and that just rips this magma into pieces, creating ash. Whereas our understanding has always been that lava would not be fragmented, so it's had a different path in the subsurface. It's simply risen up in a more kind of docile way without being fragmented to pieces in an intact way, and it's reached the surface as intact lava. And there's been some wonderful work done, especially in the Western US, looking at ancient rhyolitic lava flows. So these high silica, very thick lava flows. So here's an example of Little Glass Mountain from California. And what we're looking at here is a lava flow that's tens of meters of thick. It's something like 50 meters thick here. These are tall trees. And we can see some flow features here on the surface, loads of obsidian, and we have some pumice sticking out of the surface as well. This is a really big lava flow, much thicker than the lava that was erupted last year in Iceland. And the person who's really contributed so much to our understanding of rhyolitic lava flows is Professor John Fink at Portland State University. And I was lucky to have a guide around these field sites with John a few years back. So John and friends took us over the surface of these lava flows, and we saw that they were covered in all kinds of blocks and obsidian and some little bits of pumice, but these are what has been documented as effusive eruptions. And John's work has been so important because we've never actually watched a rhyolitic eruption take place. Basalt's like, 2 to a penny. You can see basaltic eruption every single day pretty much of the year. But rhyolite, being so highly viscous and silica rich, takes a long time to brew and is not readily erupted. So rhyolitic eruptions take place much less frequently. And we are very lucky to have had 2 rhyolitic eruptions taking place in the last decade, because we had a huge gap whilst John Fink and others were starting to study and work out what happened in rhyolitic eruptions when no one had ever actually seen one of these taking place. So we were kind of trying to guess what happened from looking at a fossil, rather like looking at a dinosaur fossil and trying to work out how it was walking. And so John's work has included lots of detail, reconstructing different parts of the lava flow and saying that there's some breccia, there's some broken stuff on the top. We then have pumice on the surface of the lava, a whole load of glassy obsidian, and then there's perhaps some ash and broken up lava at the base. So I've mentioned that there have been a couple of chances to actually closely observe rhyolitic eruption with modern techniques in the last few years. And the first of these 2 was at Chaiten in Chilean Patagonia, close to a town called Chaiten. And thankfully, nobody was killed in this eruption because there was very, very good evacuation plan put together by the authorities. And some of the first information that was shared about this was in Welsh, because we have some Welsh speakers down there in this remote part of Patagonia. So this eruption started in May 2008 after just 1 day of recorded earthquakes, and it started with a bang. This was an explosive eruption with this tremendous kind of 15-kilometer ash plume, as we can see here. And then, after a couple of weeks, it had really changed. So this view, which was taken from a helicopter by a USGS scientist, shows that we still have the ash that's being erupted. So clearly magma is breaking into pieces, but there's also lava coming out. And this is a very thick, kind of slow moving lava flow, which is just making its way down the side of this cone and gradually filling up this caldera that's about 3 kilometers in diameter. So there's a question here, well, is this an explosive eruption or is it an diffusive eruption? Because it's doing both. So we needed to make up a new term, and so we've called this a hybrid eruption, which seems to make sense to call it that because it's simply doing both things at the same time. It's multitasking, and somehow underground here we have a route for magma to be fragmenting and kind of directly going up into the ash plume. It's like it's bypassing something, whereas other parts of the magma here is able to be coming out slowly as dense lava. And that straight away made us kind of scratch our heads, and we talked with John Fink about it. Well, this means that the kind of traditional understanding that you start explosive and then you go to effusive eruptions, it seems to be very much blurred here in this middle ground, this hybrid activity. So Chai 10, we got quite a lot of observations from there, and we are still writing frantically, trying to interpret the textures and the chemistry that have in the deposits that have been created in this eruption. Here's a view of myself and some colleagues at the base of the lava dome here. This was in 2014 on a trip, so you can see this is a really tremendous dome of thick lava which was erupted at the same time as the ash plume. And when we take a look at some of the blocks of lava that have come off here, they don't kind of look how you'd expect lava to necessarily be. So this is a glassy obsidian, and we have some domains here which are banded, and then the bands seem to have been truncated and fractured. So this is not kind of happy lava. It looks like it's lava which has been fragmenting and then potentially recombining and healing before it's been reaching the surface. So this is suggesting that we've got quite a lot of complexity going on in this hybrid system. And then many of you will remember the eruption of Caudiron-Cauye. So slightly further north, but also in Patagonia in Chile. And this took place in 2011 and continued into 2012 and was also Rhyolitic. And there was a BBC News headline talking about this Chilean volcano spewing ash and spectacular images. Once again, the Chilean authorities did an incredible job of evacuating thousands of people living close to the volcano, and nobody was killed. So that's the most important part of my whole talk, really, to say that. So this eruption started, this Rhyolitic eruption started with a huge ash plume, which then made its way around the whole globe and shut airspace in New Zealand and Australia. But then it continued spewing ash for months and months and months, which really made it disruptive in Chile and Argentina. If you remember Eyjafjallajökull in 2010, that was only 3 weeks, and that caused lots of disruption in Europe. So this was much more serious disruption for far longer, being 300 days rather than 3 weeks. And that in itself was a learning experience, that a rhyolitic eruption could continue producing ash for such a long time, which is relevant thinking about Iceland, for example, because there are rhyolitic eruptions there which could take place in the future. Will they continue to be producing ash for months or even years? Because that could impact on Europe quite severely. So I was really lucky to go and see this eruption. Our second son had just been born, so I couldn't go straight away during the most powerful phase, but waited about 6 or 7 months, and the eruption was continuing. And this is what we saw. So watching it from about 2 miles from the vent, so looking into the vent here. So by vent, I mean the hole in the ground from which everything is coming out. And we've got a new edifice here. This is about 80 meters tall or so, and is a kind of Tephra cone that's been built in this eruption. And we've got an ash plume that was 2 or 3 kilometers high at the time when I took this video. And what we've got in the foreground here is lava. So this is a rhyolitic lava flow, which was moving so slowly that we can't actually see it in this video. It was moving about 2 or 3 meters per day. So kind of glacial speeds really of advance. But I'll just quickly show this video, which was taken by my colleague and friend, John Castro. So this is the eruption which is producing a rhyolitic lava flow. And this style had continued for months. And we've got really quite violent explosions taking place in the vent here. We have blocks of lava and ash being blasted out at 100 miles per hour or more than that. So a lot of explosivity. And that was the process. That explosive process was the process by which the gas, which drives these eruptions, was able to separate from the magma and enabled the generation of this gas-poor lava flow that's slowly oozing out towards us. So once again, there's a question, well, would you call this an effusive eruption or an explosive one? And I guess one could consider the terminology and what percentage of magma coming out you need to, to be taking the ratio potentially of explosive ash to effusive lava. But the kind of easier thing is simply to say, well, it's producing ash and lava. This is a hybrid event. This is a hybrid where it's multitasking and doing both. And once again, we need to be thinking about what's happening in the subsurface here to be able to create both of these different types of eruption at the same time. So this eruption finished in about April 2012. And then we got to go back there the next year and the year afterwards as well. And this is a picture that I took in 2014. We were excited to go back there and to be able to climb into the vent itself. It's the kind of smoking gun of a really large eruption. And what I should have mentioned in the previous slide is that this is actually the biggest eruption on land this century, or this was until last month when the eruption in Tonga kind of put that into the shade. So what we're looking at here, we're standing on that kind of tephra cone, looking down into the vent. And there's kind of pile of bombs and debris here. And also some interesting features where my mouse pointer is, which you can hopefully see, where you've got some broken up lava. And this lava has then been kind of snaking its way out, and it's traveled about 4 kilometers to the north. So that's 4 kilometers away there. I should also add that the lava here is up to 120 meters thick. So this is a seriously thick, large volume lava. And the final thing to mention quickly here is that these ridges that you can see, these are bits of the tephra cone, so bits of this pyroclastic fragmental stuff, which is collapsed onto the lava and then been rafted and carried away. So we're looking down here into this smoking gun. This is what was active when we've just been watching the video of. And we're able to climb right down the side here and walk in. And then we were standing about here. That's where the next photo is going to be taken. So we're now looking back up at the Tephra Ring. This is the 80-meter or so high construct. You can see loads of scree coming down and like layers of ash that's been blasted out. And here's the lava that was kind of plugging the vent. And that lava has got some notable surfaces here which look red and rather different from normal. And these exactly correspond with what we were watching in the video. These were nozzles from which the ash was being blasted out. So you didn't just have a steady flow, you had a very pulsatory flow of this high velocity kind of jet of ash and gas coming out from specific fractures and pathways that you can see in this still from the video. And these correspond exactly to the surfaces that I've just highlighted here. So we're able to look at those in some detail. And you can see where the lava here has been splitting open as it's kind of gravitationally being pulled out from the vent. And these surfaces here, these wonderful kind of slightly striated veneer covered red surfaces, which look like they've been sprayed by an aerosol somehow. There was a very fine kind of veneer of particles that were stuck to them. And so we thought, well, this looks like the nozzle that's been emitting this ash. Let's look at it in a little bit more detail. So we put it under the scanning electron microscope. And I always think this looks a bit like baked beans somehow, that you've got these kind of rounded things here in what looks like a sauce. But what we've got here are, these are clusters of ash. So by cluster, I mean kind of fragments of ash here, which are extremely small. You know, these are down to microns in grain size, but they've then been kind of melting and kind of coming together. They've been welding together to generate something which is becoming more continuous. And we've got some exceptionally fine, tiny ash particles, which are submicron, which are just kind of clustered in some of these little gaps here. So something's clearly happened here to be kind of recombining ash to make it into a more coherent material. And this is something that we can experiment with in the lab. So what we're looking at now is a video that I'll play you that was taken by a student of mine called Robin Pope a few years ago. And she took a bag of ash that had landed on top of our tent during our field work when we did the video. And so she took this and she put it into a micro furnace. So this is where you take a kind of thin section size sample and you place it inside a furnace and heat it up to, in this case, 1100 degrees C. And then you're looking at magma doing its thing. So it's like waking up an igneous thin section and watching what happens. So Robin started off here by taking these small ash particles. So these are 10 to 100 microns in size. And she simply heated them up and watched what's happened. So this has been sped up, I must say. So this took like an hour or so, and I've sped it up for you. And what's quickly happened is that these separate particles have sintered and welded together, and they've made something now that's continuous. And it's not only continuous, it's able to behave as a coherent whole, and it's flowing slightly to the side. And there's also bubbles forming, and that's because there's some dissolved water in the ash, which is then able to come out and make these bubbles, these vesicles that are growing. So we just noticed how similar these textures and processes looked to the images that we were collecting from this nozzle inside the vent, and just increasingly started thinking, well, it very much looks like at least part of this lava has been fragmented and then it's stuck itself back together again. But how much of this lava is doing that? Is it just a very small amount of the lava which is fragmenting right at the last stage? Was most of the lava coming out as an intact whole? And this is what we're really trying to work out at the moment, which is what I'm going to talk you through. So we've now recognized these ash nozzles and seen how there was this gas and ash being blasted out of the lava and actually creating some of the lava too. But that was in the vent. And we then looked here at the more distal parts of the lava. So this is 4 kilometers away at the kind of the lava flow front. My colleague Ian Skipper is about 6'6", so you can appreciate this is quite thick lava here. This is about 35 meters high. And once again, we've got some kind of reddish surfaces here that are quite prominent. And after we've been into the vent, we kind of came back to these and thought, well, actually, what could these be? And these red surfaces, we then realized that they are coated by fragments of ash and pumice. And it looks like this is then being rafted down the lava flow, just like we saw the Tephra Ring rafted on the surface as well. So this made us think, well, okay, this could be that when the first lava was coming out, then there was a process of fragmentation taking place. We had some intact lava that was being generated, but clearly we had a huge amount of fragmentation here. So then we started looking at textures within the lava, within the main body of the lava, to try to see whether this all looks like it is clastic, whether it's been recombined from fragments. It can be quite difficult because the lava does everything possible to try to hide its origins. it will crystallize and it will deform and shear and try to overprint these original textures. But we're increasingly starting to find subtle signs that there have been clastic fragmental textures in much of these lavas that we're finding. So in retrospect, this is John Fink once again in his classic US studies. He's actually standing on something here, which is part of a rhyolitic obsidian lava flow. And he's standing on something with a red surface, which has got something plastered to it. And John and ourselves very quickly realized that there's something very similar going on in all of these classic lava flows, which we simply hadn't previously noticed because we weren't looking for it. I guess it's that typical thing in geology that there's certain things that are in fashion and you see them and you ignore everything else's superfluous details. And then fashions change through the decades. So suddenly this is the thing that we're all looking at. And I'm sure there's some extra features which our kind of students in 20 years will be wondering why we're not talking about today. So here's an example of one of these ash-coated surfaces in one of these US lava flows, which has very convincingly had ash that's been fusing itself together. And also we're starting to find more and more evidence that the actual main obsidian lava itself was clastic and is being recombined. And this is leading us towards a new model of how we understand these hybrid eruptions. And this is some lovely artwork that's been done by Fabian Wadsworth. This is a kind of sneak preview of a paper that we're working on right now with Annabelle Foster and many others. So this view here, it's a kind of traditional view of a volcanic conduit, and we have magma that's rising up at depth. So this is in maybe this top 500 meters or so. There's an acceleration of this magma because the pressure is decreasing as it's rising towards the surface, meaning that the volatiles, especially the water, are coming out of being dissolved and they're forming a vapor phase. The density is decreasing, there's acceleration, pressurized bubbles are forming. And so we're ripping this magma into pieces. And that this is the kind of discharge of fragmented magma, which was feeding the first ash plume. But then through time, it's rather like a kind of car exhaust that's getting clogged up by soot, or like, like a chimney that needs sweeping. That these particles are starting to stick to the walls. And we've seen how they can then, these separate particles can sinter and weld together to form something coherent. So there's a kind of turning point where at first this kind of conduit or this vent is open, and it has been opened by kind of powerful, violent fragmentation and fracking of the rocks by gas pressure. And then you're starting to close this pathway by these particles sticking together and starting to adhere to the walls. And this is creating something here which is now dense and lava-like, but it's being produced from fragments at depth in the conduit. And this, because of the pressure gradient, it's still being pumped out. So this is then intact lava that is being pumped out to the surface, and it's doing its best to hide its fragmental past. And at the same time, we can have some kind of bypassing kind of shortcuts so that you could have zones of fragmentation here, which can make their way through fractures through this lava, and then they're coming out at the surface. And we found some fossil versions of these, and they could be only like a few tens of centimeters to say like a meter or two wide. So this is really quite localized pathways that we think can form in these dense kind of plugs that are formed of welded together lava. So this is our kind of current preferred model for how we have this gradual change in the style of a rhyolitic, of a silica-rich eruption through time. And just notice that it's not kind of turning off a tap and going from explosive ash to coherent lava. The lava has been explosive ash at depth. So it's like this eruption doesn't know how to stop breaking, how to stop fragmenting. It's almost in its nature that the magma wants to fragment. It's just a question of whether it's able to get itself together and recombine before it comes out on the surface. And thinking about why could that be the case that rhyolitic eruptions have this tendency to be hybrid? Because everywhere that we're now looking, we're finding evidence that rhyolitic eruptions do follow this style. It's because of this huge melt viscosity. We have a very silica-rich melt phase. And this means that the gases that are dissolved in the melt, which is predominantly water, as I've said, and CO2, that these gases are forming bubbles that are not able just to kind of quickly pop and get rid of the pressure. Instead, those bubbles are being trapped inside the magma as it's rising towards the surface, which makes it very difficult to get rid of that gas pressure. So in this case here, if we have magma rising upwards, it's taking the bubbles with it. Those bubbles are not able to pop and escape. So you're really keeping the volatiles, these pressurized gases with you. And you have to have this explosive process of blasting open the upper conduit to get rid of this gas. So Fabian's also played with some numbers here, and many volcanologists do conduit flow models where we put in as a kind of starting condition the gas content of the magma. So you could simply type in 4% water, which is an appropriate value for Cordon Caulier. And we could have a given width of the conduit. So we can base this from looking at fossil conduits, and we can get a feeling for their width. So for example, 25 meters could be a sensible conduit radius. And then this model is then playing with how we expect the magma to be deforming and moving. So it's taking into account bubbles forming and the acceleration of this magma as it's rising upwards. And there's a threshold where it's become too bubbly and too stiff, and it's accelerated too much, and it simply cannot flow, and instead it's going to fracture and form, fragment into these fragments of magma. And when Fabian was running this model for Cordon Caulier, he was expecting to get complete disaggregation of this magma into fragments at a depth of, say, 2 or 3 kilometers. So we're talking about complete fragmentation taking place here at considerable depth beneath the surface. And then that's simply a case that these fragments at the very beginning of the eruption are not able to recombine because you're still forcefully opening that pathway. But later on, there's going to be the welding of these particles onto the surface. So this is interesting because it's suggesting that you should have much of the magma fragmenting. And some other colleagues are saying, well, actually, we don't believe that all the magma is fragmenting. We think that only some of it is fragmenting, and there's a lot of discussion going on behind the scenes right now. So far, I've been talking about Chile and I'm talking about rhyolite in other places. But of course, a lot of this is much closer to home in Westmoreland. And hello, Clive Bolter, if you're on the call, you've got this fantastic website, English Lake District Geology. Thank you for this. And I've stolen this picture. Hope you don't mind because I didn't ask. So this is just a lovely photo of the bad step tuff on Crinkle Crags, which I'm sure many of you know. So this is a silicic kind of pyroclastic deposit with this wonderful flow folding here, where we can see that it's been behaving as a coherent body that's been able to deform and rheomorphically flow. And the models for this, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, was that it was emplaced as particles. It was emplaced as an ignimbrite, which was then able to weld, become coherent, and then do its lava-like flow behavior afterwards. So we have really quite relevant and important rocks on our doorstep. And Mike Branney and Pete Kokola, who many of you will know or know of, with Brian McConnell, have written very nicely about this in a classic paper on the bad step tuff, talking about this lava-like rheomorphic ignimbrite. And so they show some textures which look very much coherent. This is in thin section. showing that we have this kind of flow of what were these fragments that have then come together to very much look like lava. But this is not at the vent. This is some distance from the vent that fed the Basaltic tuff. So there's the idea here is that the recombination took place at some distance from the vent. It has this kind of brief life as a particulate material before recombining. And that's perhaps slightly different from what we have been talking at, what we've been looking at in Coron Cowyer. So Mike's model was that you had the ash and ignimbrite was gathering here very rapidly until it remained sufficiently hot to be fusing and welding together. And it was then moving under its own weight, whilst you had particles still streaming over the surface. And there are many absolutely spectacular rheomorphic ignimbrites. With no disrespect to Cumbria, I've chosen a slightly fresher version from Argentina just to highlight some of these features. That we have the Fiame, which are these flattened, what used to be pumices, and have now been completely compacted and squashed. So this is a rheomorphic ignimbrite, so one which has been flowing after it's recombined. And Mike and colleagues have written very nicely about this in their paper. So they talk about a spectrum of different silicic characteristics of eruptions and deposits. So we've just been looking at the Basaltic tuff, and this would fall into this category of lava-like ignimbrites, which means that we have agglutination, it's kind of sticking together. There's some viscous flow, so kind of coherent fluid-like flow taking place during and after emplacement, and it has various different features here of being able to froth up, etc. And then there's a variety of different types of ignimbrite here. So for example, the non-welded ones here, you don't have that kind of welding and compaction and fusing of clasts. And notice that on here, we don't really have kind of traditional lavas mentioned. We have high temperature fountain-fed lava flows, but clearly what we saw at Coron Cowyer doesn't fit into this category. So potentially, we need to really rather rethink some of this terminology and how would we put a rhyolitic lava flow into this spectrum. So I look forward to discussing this with you all and also with Mike and colleagues, because there's lots of issues to think about here. So much for silicic stuff and rhyolite. I guess probably it's tempting to think, well, it's hybrid because it's really high viscosity, and that's just a kind of peculiarity of rhyolitic eruptions. But I just thought I'd briefly throw this in as a provocation from La Cumbre Vieja on La Palma. And I guess many of you have been following this with as much interest as I have in the previous months. So this is a much less silica-rich magma. We're looking at tephrite. So it's quite alkali-rich, but it's poor in silica and much lower viscosity than the rhyolite. But what was this eruption? What is this style of eruption? What should we call this? Because it's producing a lot of lava is being emitted, but also we have some considerable ash plumes as well. Perhaps the difference here is that we have different vents that are active. So we're not actually producing the lava and the ash from exactly the same hole in the ground. Potentially that's a contrast. But it's certainly fascinating that we're having both styles of activity taking place at the same time. And it makes you want to kind of be able to cut through this and try to better understand what is happening in the subsurface. How about basaltic andesite? So many of you will have also followed last year the eruption of Soufriere St. Vincent in the Caribbean, which started off with the very gentle effusion of a basaltic andesite lava dome. This is my PhD student Tivon Howe, who's doing a PhD project on this eruption, another in the Lesser Antilles Arc. So this was, I think, really was a truly effusive eruption. It looks in that this strange dome of extremely crystal rich and very highly viscous basaltic andesite was very slowly emitted. with no ash emissions at all. And this is thought to be a remnant from the previous eruption in 1979 that's been stalled and stagnant and gradually crystallizing in the intervening 40 years. But it may be things not quite as simple as we think. So that's just to show the composition here that we're in the basaltic andesite fields, so still quite low silica. Because some thin sections from this is a phenocryst from this lava dome, and it's quite clearly been broken here. So even though this is lava, which we are assuming hasn't fragmented and it's just doing its gently effusive thing, if we now start looking in detail, this looks like it has actually broken to pieces. So perhaps this took place in 1979, or perhaps it was taking place beneath this dome at a depth of a couple of kilometers. And this could be part of the reason why it was able to lose its gas and therefore come out in this very gas-poor manner. So Devon's just sent off some samples for thin sections today, and we look forward to getting those back soon and then looking in more detail at these textures. Let's stay low silica and think about whether magma has fragmented underground or not. And Stromboli is this classic case of a basaltic eruption, and you'll have seen the kind of Strombolian eruptions with these sudden pulses. And there's been a study last year by Jacopo Tadeucci, who's in Rome, and he looked in more detail at the ash that was been coming out in Stromboli and realized that many of the crystals have actually been broken. They've been broken, but then they've been fused back together again. So this looks a bit like a leg, which you just want to be kind of better cast and like put together so it can properly mend itself there. So this kind of fracture here that we've got, it's recording a fragmentation event in the subsurface, in the conduit, but it's so perfectly healed that this kind of melt here has able to get it into the fracture and perfectly heal itself. So we would have had no idea that this was once fragmental magma. And Jacopo was able to find this in nature and also reconstruct exactly the same thing experimentally by getting a kind of tub of high temperature basalt and shocking it, and then looking at the textures that were formed. So this is quite interesting because it's suggesting that even basalt as well might be fragmenting in the subsurface and then recombining and welding itself back together again prior to being ejected in explosions. And we can therefore potentially expand that and say, well, this fragmentation, if it's so efficient at fusing itself back together again, it could just be coming out as lava too. So just to show you, yes, this is absolutely in the low silica end of things. So we think that there could potentially be quite similar stories here of this hidden subsurface magma fragmentation taking place in this low silica magma. If we go to Katla, which many of you will know in Iceland, the kind of big sister of Eyjafjallajökull, which I think I talked about a bit last year. So her most recent eruption in 1918 was a really big phreatomagmatic eruption with lots of magma-water interaction taking place and produced a hugely powerful meltwater flood that came down here. And Jackie Owen, who was then a postdoc in Lancaster, studied the tephra that came out of this eruption in a lot of detail. So she's now looking at, these are kind of fragments of basalt that have been ejected in this explosive eruption. And Jackie, everywhere she looked, just found signs that it had fragmented in the subsurface and then it is stuck back together again. It was remarkable how much evidence that she found for this. And this evidence was preserved in this case because the magma was ripped apart and quickly cooled by the meltwater because it was in a subglacial setting under lots of ice. And she thinks that this process of quickly quenching the magma means that we were able to see and get this like little snapshot of it having been fragmented in the subsurface. If that hadn't taken place, it would have been these bombs would have been able to have expanded and vesiculated and crystallized, or lava would have come out that would have completely overprinted this signature. So then that raises the questions, for example, the biggest lava eruption this century to date at Bunker. Was this, in some sense of the word, could it be considered to be hybrid? Was there actually magma fragmentation taking place in the vent? And this was a photo I collected, which quite clearly shows it was. It's what we call a Hawaiian eruption, so a kind of quite powerfully ejected magma coming out here. And some Icelandic volcanologists have been looking at these ash particles and finding very similar textures to what Jacobo found from Stromboli, that this magma has been really blasting to pieces and then welding and recombining in the top hundreds of meters. And this is the kind of fountain that is actually feeding the lava flow. So you could actually argue that the lava flow has had a fragmental past as well, even though it's the biggest basalt of this century. I'm not going to go into it for this, this lecture, but we're becoming increasingly suspicious that actually many intrusions may be taking place in a fragmental condition as well. So, for example, we think that many sills and laccoliths, when they're first being emplaced, actually what's taking place is that you have fragmented fragmented magma that is filling up your pathway, and then that's welding back together again. But that's maybe a future talk, because we've got some more work to try to convince ourselves that we're completely right. But we like the idea that to say that, you know, potentially you could argue maybe quite comfortably that all silicic lava has been fragmental. Let's try and play with this idea and expand it into basalt. But we could go even further and say many intrusions may actually be fragmental at first. So, you know, asking questions about Fagradalsfjall, was this in some sense a hybrid eruption? Was there fragmentation of much of this magma taking place in the subsurface? This looks very gentle, kind of oozing here. But if we take a film, which I've got for you, we can see that maybe there was some fragmentation taking place at the vent. I'll just turn the sound off because it may be a bit laggy for you. So this is a spectacular drone capture from Björn Steinbeck, one of the many people who are closely photographing this basaltic eruption. So here we've got our snaking river of low viscosity runny basalt, but look where it's coming from. It's coming from a vent there where there is magma just being ripped into pieces, and that's then recombining to be forming the intact lava. So to some extent, could we even consider that to be a hybrid eruption? Even though there's not such fragmentation into tiny ash fragments, it's still fragmentation taking place. So Mike Branney, and you know, we've already seen this in terms of this spectrum of different amounts of welding and recombination of silicic deposits. I guess it's a question of, could we almost try to expand this into the broader magmatic compositional spectrum as well? Could we go lower silica? Hopefully we can, in some cases, play with these ideas. So this word clustergenic, we like, it has like a kind of medical meaning, but in this case, we mean clast as in fragments, clustergenic as in its origin is from fragments. Could all lava or much lava actually be clustergenic? So I'm very interested to hear your thoughts on this slightly wacky proposition that we're making. And of course, everything that we seem to do in science, I'm kind of increasingly realizing this as I move into my 40s, is just reinventing wheels that people have previously been thinking about in huge detail. So for example, we had some really great Armenian geologists and volcanologists in the 1950s and 60s. And they were already writing about ignimbrites and comparing them with tuffo lavas. And they had this interesting definition of what a tuffo lava is, which hasn't really been taken up since then. So they're talking about it being based on the structure of the ground mass. So the idea that it's pyroclastic, for ignimbrite, so clearly from fragments, and lava-like for tuffo lavas. But we're finding that in many cases, that pyroclastic structure just gets destroyed when the lava is flowing. So, you know, potentially we could argue that these tuffo lavas are all entirely pyroclastic. But this is going to be a lot of fun to go back through all these old texts from the 60s, which are really beautifully written, and potentially to try to go to Armenia and find some of the deposits which they've been writing about. So that's me done with my provocation. I wanted just to put 2 more slides in. So this is a slide from my 2021 talk, where we were looking inside Icelandic volcanoes. And I think we had a bit of a vote around us of what we thought was going to erupt next, because we'd had Balthabunga was our kind of surprising most recent eruption. And this was at the time when there was some of the unrest taking place on Reykjanes Peninsula, close to Reykjavik. So we can now fill in this question mark that it was Fagradalsfjall, and that went on for several months. We don't know, of course, whether that's the only phase that's going to take place or whether there's going to be multiple phases of activity in the coming years and decades. Or it's a question of, well, what next? Because Iceland is continuing to surprise us with creative new ways of erupting from different places. And a very final slide, I want to just mention this book, which maybe several of you have heard about this. I very strongly recommend it. It's by a fellow Factweight person, Ian Francis. Not sure whether you know Ian. He's a great geologist who's worked much of his career in geological publishing. And now he's retired. He's had the chance to put together this beautiful book with Bruce Yardley and Stuart Holmes. And we're going to get these folks to come and talk to us about their book, hopefully early next year. So this is their website, which I recommend looking at. They have a nice Google Earth project where you can see many different geological sites that there. So thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to you all telling me that this is a wild idea and fun, but wrong. Thank you.
Absolutely excellent. Very good. Very good.
Yeah, thanks, Hugh. That was an
Brilliant.
enlightening talk, and I guess it will have stirred a few questions in the audience tonight. So if anybody would like to start a discussion, you're most welcome to come forward, unmute, put your video on, ask you your question.
Shall I start the ball rolling?
Oh, hi, Clive. Nice website.
I don't mind the work being used as long as it's acknowledged. It's open go. So, thinking about large igneous provinces, particularly the felsic ones, you've got their sort of 1,000 cubic kilometer sheets of rhyolitic material, maybe 2,000 or 3,000 cubic kilometers. The sort of standard discussion is that they could be lavas, they could be lava-like ignimbrites, or they might even be sills in some cases. And one of the ways to discriminate is, are the crystals intact or fragmented? And there are people who say that in 1,000 cubic kilometer sheet, they don't see any fragmented crystals at all, i.e. phenocrysts. Are they not looking closely enough?
That's an excellent question. I would love to see these in much more detail. Definitely, if you're failing to fragment them, the phenocrysts, then it cannot have been pulverized to a size smaller than the phenocryst. So that is definitely a kind of spanner in the works here. In terms of the volume, that's an interesting one. I've recently been reading about some incredible places in Mexico where there are kind of tough or ignimbrite filled dikes that are 200 meters wide and extend for many, many kilometers. So I don't worry so much about the upscaling of this kind of clastic story, but definitely those intact phenocrysts are much more difficult to explain.
Yeah, I was thinking about the Gawler Range in South Australia, that's the one that I know best, Jocelyn McPhee sort of says the phenocryst distribution is almost perfectly uniform throughout this whole 1,000 cubic kilometers, and they're not broken.
And they're not broken at all.
Yeah, so she says.
Joyce is a fantastic geologist, and I have faith in what she's saying.
Yeah.
In which case, that is interesting, whether you actually would have fragmentation taking place, but larger particles, or whether this is a particular case where actually you've escaped from that scenario of having complete fragmentation.
Yeah.
Interesting. Thank you.
Shall I go next?
Oh, Bernard.
I have to admit that when I studied volcanology as a student, God knows how many years ago, it absolutely bored me to tears. But,
shocking.
Professionally, I've had to study a number of things, like the multi-phase flow in pipelines, and particularly in well bores.
Oh, wow.
Where you've got what's essentially an analog to a volcanic process. Yeah. And in my total ignorance of this volcanology and such like, I have to say that your hybrid model is exactly what I would have anticipated. I'm not going to go into the details of it, but if
You're welcome to.
Well, it would just take too long. There are a whole lot, I think one thing that you could well look at is the thermodynamics of the fusion of the whole process of the volcanic eruption. And one thing in particular that I studied 50 odd years ago, I don't think there's anything much in the literature about this, it's a thing called the kinetic jet effect. And that's it, that when you're projecting material up the wellbore or the volcanic vent, it's got to get from effectively quite a low velocity movement to a very high velocity movement. So it's got to gain kinetic energy. Yeah, and it's got to get the kinetic energy from somewhere. And the only way that it can do it, because it's essentially an isentropic flow, is by cooling. So when the material exits from the vent, it is probably going to be relatively cool. I say relatively.
Yeah.
But as soon as it loses velocity, it will heat up again very rapidly. And I think when you start thinking about these kinds of things, that you can see why the various kinds of sintering and some of the effects that you've been describing would actually follow from this kind of process. It's just an idea off the top of my head. But
that's really interesting. Well, yeah, thank you for this. We've been playing a little bit, but in ignorance of the kind of important industrial perspectives that have been gained on multi-phase flow and sintering. And one of the things that I was reading about was about plastics being generated. So how to make intact plastics from many pellets that were being delivered through pathways. And there could be problems with these pathways because you could have frictional heating and then it all becomes kind of clogged up. And there's some quite creative invention of having bends called pelbows to try to stop this from taking place. And when we were looking at the vents that I was describing at Cordon Carrier and these nozzles, in some cases, you seem to have areas where they were flaring, and then you had... It looked like there was lots of cooling that was taking place. And if there was a constriction, then you could have frictional heating and more of the sintering. So I would love to know much more about the industrial applications. If any of you've got experience or knowledge, I'd love to talk this through with you and like hear what you know about it. Thank you.
Oh, someone's got pudges in the background.
Yeah, I just got an observation. I don't know whether it's at all relevant, but climbing up mountains in the lakes, which I do quite often, at the tops of them, obviously in the BVG sort of central area, you often get rocks that look as if they've been splattered with something that's fractured and then it's been removed. And I found this quite often. People say it was a welded something that the blobs have dropped out of, but it looks exactly like the crystal images that you say with fractures, like a jigsaw that's been fractured and frozen in time in the center. It's definitely in the BVG rocks, right in the center. And it just kind of makes sense.
I would absolutely love to see more of this. I mean, I guess there must be many cases of all different ages and compositions